Shalom, everybody, and welcome to Youth for Torah, where we dig deep into God's Word to learn more about Him. Very well, let's continue with our Parashot studies. We are now on Parasha number 5, called Chayei Sarah, and this we can read it from Genesis chapter 23 till chapter 25, verse 18. So it starts out by saying that Sarah had lived to be 127 years old, and she dies in the land or in the city of Kiryat Arba, which is another name for Hebron that you guys can see here on the map that was close to Mamre. So, what's interesting about this city, Kiryat Arba, is that it means city of the four. But it also, Arba is not only four, but it also was a name of a certain individual. If we read in Joshua 14:15, it says, "Now the name of Hebron before time was Kiryat Arba, which Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim, and the land had rest from war." So, as we recall, or if you have heard before, the Anakim were a race of giants. So Arba was in fact a giant. In other words, Kiryat Arba was a city of a giant or of giants. A small commentary that we can see from Rashi is that he says that it could be, since it's city of four, and it's talking about four particular individuals, it could be Arba, the giant, and his three giant sons, or there could have been four giants in total. But of course, what we find in scripture is Joshua 14:15 that talks about one certain individual who was in fact a giant. But what we see here is that this was in fact a city of giants. So that is an interesting fact about Kiryat Arba. Now, why was Sarah there? We don't know. But another thing that we need to remember is that in the previous parasha, in Genesis 22:19, if we recall, it says that Abraham was settled in Beersheba, that is more toward the south, toward the Negev. So the big question that comes to mind is, why was Sarah in Hebron and Abraham in Beersheba? We know that Abraham was in Beersheba not only because of the previous parasha, but because on verse 2 it says, "And came Abraham to mourn and weep for Sarah." So he had to go to where Sarah was, he had to travel. Not only that, but there is a distance of almost or approximately 43 kilometers between Beersheba and Hebron, or Kiryat Arba. Now, Torah doesn't add any reason as to why Sarah was in Kiryat Arba and Abraham was in Beersheba, but what we do know for sure is that he was not there when she died. He had to go there. And the ages at that time, if Sarah died at the age of 127, we know that Abraham was 10 years older than her, so he was 137. And if Abraham was 137, that means that Yitzhak was 37, because of course Yitzhak was born when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. So just to keep that in mind about the ages, so we can imagine how they were in those times. Then we see that in order to seek or to request for a burial site, he goes and speaks to the sons of Het, requesting for a burial site for his wife. Now, who was Het? If we go back a few parashas in Genesis 10:15, it says, "And Canaan begat Sidon, his firstborn, and Het, who was his secondborn." So they were descendants of Ham, but from Canaan's secondborn, Het. Now, Het means terror or dread, and Het comes from Hatat, that means to deplete of courage. So this kind of gives you the characteristics of this certain group of people. They kind of liked to inflict terror on people and scare them. And of course, he was the ancestor of the Hittites that we will see later on that the Israelites, I'm sorry, are going to have to face them to basically acquire the promised land. Then we see something else that's quite interesting. After Abraham speaks to the sons of Het, the sons of Het call Abraham Nasi Elohim. In some Bibles, it's translated as a mighty or a great prince, but that is not what it says there. There it says Nasi Elohim, which means a prince of God. But Nasi could actually mean one lifted up. It could also mean a chief. And this is fascinating because if we are seeing right now where Abraham is living, he was surrounded by different types of nations who were in a way like pagan or distant from what God would teach. The only one who was obedient to Elohim, the one who would follow his covenant, his commandments, and everything, was Abraham. So this special connection that he had with Elohim was actually something that characterized Abraham in all of that society in which he lived in. So this is something important that we need to keep in mind. If we are sons and daughters of Abraham, we also need to live a life by which we are recognized or known as. How beautiful is it for somebody to know you as a servant of the Most High God, that they see you different, that they see you stand out because you love God and you follow His words. It's sad if they would know you otherwise, as someone who's a liar, or someone that's a hypocrite, or someone who does things to hurt others, etc. But this is really nice because he had this spiritual status among them. They knew that he had a special connection with Elohim, and that's why they respected him. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. Very well. So in verses 7 through 9, we see that Abraham requests to buy the cave of Machpelah from Ephron, the son of Zohar. So Machpelah. The question now that comes to our mind is, of course, he was requesting for a burial site, but he didn't say, give me any burial site you have. No, he specifically requests a certain cave called Machpelah. So we ask ourselves now, why did Abraham request for this cave? Is there a meaning or a purpose behind it? Did Abraham know exactly why that cave was important? There are many things that we can deduce or assume. There's not an explicit reason stated in the Torah, but we can try to find the answer in the name of Machpelah itself and according to some traditions that the Jewish people have. So, first of all, Machpelah comes from the word kafal, which means to double or double, to double. And this is quite interesting because, and this is a little bit of a spoiler alert here, but in the cave of Machpelah, people were buried individually. They were buried in couples. So Sarah was buried in Machpelah, and later on, when Abraham dies, he is buried with Sarah. And we will see the same is for Yitzhak and Rivka. Sorry for the spoiler, and for Yaakov and Leah. So the word Machpelah, that comes from kafal, to double, would actually come about. It would serve its purpose because they were buried by twos, by couples. And the second reason that Abraham could have had to have chosen the cave of Machpelah is if what Jewish tradition says is in fact true, then the cave of Machpelah would also be the burial site of Adam and Chava. There are more details on this. If you guys want, you can go and read it. But Jewish tradition says that the first people to have been buried there were Adam and Chava, And if this is true, and Abraham had knowledge of it, that the first people on earth, the father and mother of all mankind, were buried there, then that would be more than enough a reason for Abraham to have chosen it. But since we don't know precisely if this is true, we cannot say so. But at least this is a good idea or reason that Abraham could have had. Then we see in verses 10 and 16, Ephron comes into the picture because he was in the group of people that Abraham was talking to, and he was actually quite cunning because we see that the Hittites or the sons of Het were willing to give their burial sites to Abraham, but Abraham wanted to pay for the burial sites to make it his own. And if we remember what we just saw, Abraham was only requesting for the cave, but Ephron comes and tells him, no, don't only have the cave, but take the field as well. You might think, oh, he's being super nice, he's giving him double the cave and the field. No, this is actually a very smart way to get more money. So we see that Ephron was quite cunning in order to obtain a large sum of money, because Abraham only requested the cave, but Ephron offered the cave and the field, thus making the sum to pay higher. And he is also quite smart in asking for the amount that he wanted, because he does not directly say how much he wanted Abraham to pay. Like say, hey Abraham, I want you to pay me this much for the field and for the cave. But he says it, he asks for it indirectly, saying, what is 400 silver shekels between you and me? This is kind of like as if I want to sell you my phone, but you are requesting for a phone and I don't want it to seem like I'm selling it to you. So I tell you, hey, my phone costed me $500, but it's okay, you can have it. So then what are you gonna do? You're gonna say, here, if it costed you $500, I'll give you the $500. So I did not directly ask you for the amount of money, but it was in a way that I made you pay that amount of money. So here, this is what Ephron actually did. So he gave Abraham the amount of money that he wanted Abraham to pay. So Abraham pays him the 400 silver shekels, and the Bible says that it is equivalent to approximately 10 pounds of silver. Now, if we convert the amount of silver, or if we see the price of silver nowadays, that sum would come up to about $3,500. But that is not the way that we need to see it. First of all, we need to see how much in Bible times was 400 silver shekels. And we can have an idea from Judges 17:10. In Judges 17:10, it says, and Micah said unto him, dwell with me and be unto me a father and a priest, when he was talking to the Levite. And I will give thee 10 shekels of silver by the year, and a suit of apparel and thy victuals. So the Levite went in. So here with this verse, we can see that, I mean, it could vary between the different social statuses or economical statuses that the people had in that time, but a year's wages or a year's salary was in fact 10 silver shekels. So let's convert that, because I'm sorry. So we see that if in a year a man was paid 10 silver shekels, of course, what Abraham paid Ephron was 400 silver shekels, so 40 times that amount. So it's kind of hard to convert the economy of that time with our current economy, but just to have an idea of how much it could have cost, or basically to give it some value or meaning to us, let's look at it this way. In the US, the average year's wages or the yearly salary is 54,300, I'm sorry, $54,132 per year and for the average American worker. And if we multiply this by 40, we're going to get $2,165,220 in total. So let's imagine that this was in fact the price of those times. So that is the amount of money that Abraham paid Ephron in order to purchase both the cave and the field, just so you guys can have an idea. Very well, so Abraham acquires the land and cave and buries Sarah. In chapter 24, the scene changes a bit. We can see that some time has transpired after the death of Sarah, and the next parasha will see exactly how much time had gone since the death of Sarah to this moment. But just let's just continue with what Torah says. And in verses 1 to 4, we see that Adonai had blessed Abraham in everything. And we see that Abraham addresses the servant, in the Bible says, who had served him the longest. Okay? Keep that in mind. Who had served him the longest. In other words, the one that is the most trusted. And he says some interesting things to the servant. First of all, he says, put your hand under my thigh. Now, according to Ibn Ezra, Rasbam, and Hiskuni, that are some rabbinic commentators, it literally means the thigh. So here you can see the leg, the upper part of the leg, and it's under. So in other words, behind the upper part of the leg. And they also comment that the custom in those days was for a man to put his hand under the one who rules over him to underscore the importance of the task and the servant's commitment to it. Because if you put your hand under the thigh, let's just say I were your boss, and you were to put your hand under my thigh, if I sit down, I would literally be squishing your hand. In other words, you can't move. So in a way, it's like saying you are supposed to be 100% or even more, 110% committed to fulfilling this request I'm asking you, because I'm entrusting you blindly with it. And so we see that this servant does in fact do that. The second point that Abraham tells his servant is, you will not choose a wife for my son from among the women of the Canaanite. This has a big spiritual and physical importance. First of all, if we remember the society that they were living in, this is actually extremely important. Just the previous parasha, when we talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, if we saw how, for example, in another parasha, when we talked about the Tower of Babel, and so many other examples, the people around them or surrounding them were corrupt people. They were in a way Torahless. Of course, in that time there wasn't a physical Torah, but they did not fear or follow God the way Abraham did. And as we can see, this was important in order to protect Yitzhak from any pagan influence. And we will see later on in future parashas that the same command is going to be given to the Israelites. But this is also physically important, because if we remember Yishmael and Yitzhak, Yishmael was not chosen as the son of the inheritance, for he was the son of Hagar, the one that Adonai had not intended to be the progenitor. It had to be Sarah. And if we remember from the previous parasha, Hagar was a descendant of Ham. And all of the Canaanite women of all of the time, Canaan, if we remember as well, was also a descendant of Ham. So here if Yitzhak would intermarry with a Canaanite woman, then we would see that the genetics would change, and he would have, just like Yishmael, he would be part his descendants would be partly Ham and partly Shem. And if we remember, Ham had brought upon himself a curse, so the curse would be transmitted. So that is why those are the two main fundamental reasons why Yitzhak could not marry a Canaanite. The third point that Abraham tells his servant is that he was to choose a wife from his own kinsmen, from his homeland. So here we have all of the descendants of Shem, but all of these would be relatives, some distant, but relatives of Abraham. But Abraham's kinsmen themselves, better said, would in fact be from the line of either Nahor or Haran. But if we remember, Lot's sons Moab and Ben-Ami were conceived by incest, so this could not do. Nahor, on the other hand, if we remember from the previous parasha, he had taken a wife, Milcah, and he had children. So it would have to be, or the best possibility would be from Nahor's part of the family. And the servant asks Abraham if he can't find a wife for Yitzhak if he is to take him back to the land. And Abraham says, no, not at all. Do not bring my son back there. Now, let's remember from the Parasha Lech Lecha, when Adonai takes Abraham out of his homeland, let's remember where or what this homeland was, where it was. If this homeland was in fact Mesopotamia. And if we remember, Mesopotamia and all the surrounding cities were, in a way, the kingdom of Nimrod, or had that initial, or that it was the birthplace of Babylon. So it had all of this immense evil and corrupt influence. So, first of all, if Yitzhak would be taken back here, he would be under him. Well, he and all the descendants after him would kind of like get assimilated into this pagan or Babylonian civilization, and that would kind of mess up all of the huge and beautiful plan that Adonai had made for them. And secondly, and Abraham himself says it in the verse, is that Adonai had promised the land of Canaan to him and his descendants. So if they leave and go back to where they had come from, it's like as if they were telling Adonai, you know what? We do not want the promised land. We're going to go back to where we were. It's not working out. So it wasn't a complete act of defiance, of doubt, and disobedience. So that's something that could not have been done. And we also see that Abraham puts again faith in action. In verse 7, he says, he will send, he referring to Adonai, he will send his angel ahead of you, and you are to bring a wife for my son from there. Abraham was certain that this servant was in fact going to bring back a wife for his son, but he wanted the servant to believe that too. So, if you guys have not already noticed it, I'm pretty sure most of you have already, but it does not mention the servant's name. The only thing that we can get from this chapter is that it was the servant who had served him the longest. So the big question is, do we know the servant? Of course, throughout the chapter, the whole chapter doesn't say the servant's name, but we can probably deduce out of previous parashas and Bible verses a possibility of who this nameless servant is. If we go to Genesis 15, 2 to 3, it says, Abraham said, O Lord God, what will you give me since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus or Damascus? And Abraham said, Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. So, with this verse, we can see that Eliezer from Damascus was a servant to Abraham, and he had been a servant that was born in the house of Abraham, and Abraham had even considered of him being the heir if he wouldn't have had children. In other words, he was the one that was the most trusted, the one that was closer. And if he had been born in his house, so Eliezer had basically served Abraham his entire life. So with this, we can say two things. If the servant had been the one that served him the longest, then Eliezer was in fact a candidate because he had been with Abraham ever since he was born, so his entire life. That could be the longest. And if he is in fact the most trusted servant, then it would make sense because just as it says here, Abraham had even thought about giving his inheritance to Eliezer. So it is highly probable, of course, the Torah doesn't say, but it's highly probable that the servant that was going to do this for Abraham was Eliezer. And if it would have been Eliezer, that would have been extremely beautiful, because the name Eliezer means my God is my help, or God has helped. And we will see that this, how every name has a purpose, every meaning of a name has a purpose in the life of that person. It tells you about characteristics of the person. We saw that with the names of Elohim. So if the servant was Eliezer, we'll see throughout the story how this meaning, my God is my help, or God has helped, will come about and will fulfill its purpose. So we see that this servant, who I personally think is Eliezer, takes 10 camels and all kinds of gifts and goes to Aram Naharaim in the land of Nahor. So here we see the big loyalty that this servant had, because he had to go back to the land. In other words, he had to travel all the way back to the initial place from where Abraham had traveled to where he currently is. So that is a long trip. And we see in verses 11 through 14, when he arrives to Aram Naharaim, this servant, Eliezer, asks God, for Ezer, help. He asks God for help. So he's starting to bring about the meaning of his name, the purpose of his name. And he asks God for a sign. He tells God, please help me know which is the wife you want for my master's son. If when I ask this woman to give me a drink of water, she tells me, yes, drink, sir, and I will also give water to your camels, then I will know that my trip has been successful. Verse 15 says that he had hardly finished praying when a girl appears. When our Elohim, when our Adonai has a plan, it's perfect. There's nothing that can interfere with his plan, and he has perfect timing. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we have a hard time and we try to wrap our heads around some situations, but that our Adonai has already taken care of. That's why we need to put our trust in him, focus completely on him, and just live our lives for him. Because sometimes when we try to do things our own way, it does not go well. So he had barely finished praying when Rivka, of course here it says Rebecca, but Rivka, the daughter of Bethuel, son of Nahor, appeared. son of Nahor, Abraham's brother. In other words, this was what this was what Yitzhak needed, what Abraham requested for a wife that came from his kinsman, a descendant of Shem, but a direct relative to Abraham. In other words, a descendant of Nahor. And it was just perfectly and precise. Rivka appears. Now, Rivka in her name means to bind, to tie, or to connect. We're going to see how her the meaning of her name is going to be fulfilled later on. Verse 16 gives us some characteristics of Rivka. It says that Rivka was a beautiful young woman and she was a virgin. She had never been touched by a man. So this is another thing that is makes her the perfect candidate, because she was pure, innocent, as was Yitzhak. We see then that the servant runs to her and asks her for water, and she replies the exact same words that he had requested Adonai. She was very hospitable, just like Abraham, her relative, and she literally went above and beyond, because first of all, she didn't know this man. He had just come. She probably had never seen him in her entire life. And despite that, she gave him water to drink, and she watered his 10 camels. Now, like in this painting or picture, sometimes we think, oh, like she had to add just a little bit of water and that's it. No. First of all, let's remember how many camels did this servant, who I think is Eliezer, bring to Aram Naharaim? 10 camels. Now, the big question is, how much can a camel drink? Did you know that a camel can drink up to 20 gallons or 76 liters at a time? Because we know that camels can go on many days without drinking a drop of water. But their way of compensating that is that when they do drink water, they are capable of storing large quantities of liquid. And so that is why in one single drink, in other words, when they stop to drink for a while, they can drink up to 20 gallons. In other words, if we're talking about 10 camels, we are talking about 200 gallons or 760 liters. That is a lot. And we know that she came out with a jug. Of course, it doesn't say the capacity of the jug. It doesn't say how much her jug could hold, but let's suppose or let's assume that it is a jug that can hold 5 gallons or 23 liters. Kind of like our conventional jug that holds 5 gallons. So she would have to fill up that 5-gallon jug and carry it all the way to where the camels were 40 times. Can you imagine yourself carrying 5 gallons of water or 23 liters of water 40 times in order to give water to camels of a person that you have never seen in your entire life? That is truly amazing. Rivka was, in fact, a special lady. Very well. And then we see how, and even more, later on in verse 25, she even adds, apart from having watered the camel, says, we have plenty of straw and fodder and room for staying overnight. So basically, she was saying, I can also feed your camels and give you a place to stay if you need it. Then in verse 27, we see the fulfillment of Eliezer's name, if in fact this servant was Eliezer. He said, Blessed be Adonai, the God of my master Avraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, Adonai has led me in the way to the house of my master's relatives. In other words, his name, my God is my help, did in fact come true because Adonai had been his help in order to bless Avraham. Then we see from verses 29 and 30 a small hint of Lavan's greed that we're going to see in a future parasha. Not the next one. Uh, another parasha that's coming up. It says, when he saw the jewelry of gold on Rivka, because the servant had given Rivka a nose ring and beautiful gold jewelry to adorn herself. When he sees the gold, it's not that he first heard what Rivka had told him or he saw the man. No, it says when he sees the gold, he runs out to meet Eliezer. In other words, his hospitality, different to Rivka's, was out of pure interest. He had interest in gaining money, gold, riches. That was his focus. But on the other hand, Rivka's focus was not that. Her focus was selfless. She was generous and kind and pure. So that kind of personality or that kind of way of being is what I personally think made Adonai choose Rivka to be Yitzhak's wife. Then we see from verse 33 through 49 how determined Eliezer was to fulfill the oath he had made to Abraham, his master. He didn't even want to eat until he told them all why he had come there. That is true loyalty. And in the morning, Eliezer requests to be sent off with the girl so he can go and fulfill completely his mission. And of course, the family does not want the girl to leave, and the girl asks to stay at. The family of the girl asks Eliezer if she could at least stay 10 more days. But when he continues to insist for they to leave, they call for the girl and they ask her in verse 58, will you go with this man? Remember, this is a man that she had just met yesterday. She did not know who he was. She probably had heard of Abraham, but probably had never seen him in person. This meant that she would have to leave her family's home and travel kilometers of distance, many kilometers of distance, to go to an unknown place to marry an unknown man. If you stop and think for a while, that is a very hard decision to take. But Rivka didn't hesitate. In Genesis 24:58, we see that she says, I will go. Now this is truly a step and act of faith, just like Abraham would have done. Because she knew that all of these doings were Elohim's, and she had no doubt in her Creator. In the same way, we ought to be. Sometimes some decisions can be a little bit hard to take, but if we know that they are from our Elohim, let's not hesitate and let's go for it. Very well. In verse 16, we see that they bless Rivka. Now, we're going to see next parasha, but I'm just going to start giving you a small little glimpse of it. Blessings are extremely important in a family, between friends, or anywhere. Blessings are not just like, oh, may you have a wonderful day. Not that kind of blessing. When a father or mother blesses their children, when you bless a friend, when Adonai blesses you, these words of blessing acquire a certain function or acquire a purpose, a meaning, and it is in fact prophetical. We're going to see that in the next parasha, but we're also going to see it with this small blessing. It says, they blessed Rivka with these words, our sister, may you be the mother of millions, and may your descendants possess the cities of those who hate them. Now you might say, oh, that's nice, but no, every blessing that is given upon children is going to happen. And it did. Just flash forward to when we go into, past the Torah and we enter into the Nevi'im, the book of Joshua, we see that Israel, in fact, became millions and millions of people, and they overcame the cities of their enemies, and that is how they inherited the promised land. So these words which they had blessed Rivka actually came to pass. That is why we need to be careful with what we speak, with what we say, because if we utter words of blessing, these words of blessing are actually going to happen. Adonai hears what we say and blesses a person. But if we use our lips, our tongue wrongfully to curse others or to insult others, we are bringing a curse and an insult upon ourselves. And that is something I don't think anybody wants. And besides, who wants to harm somebody else? It's not good. Anyway, let's continue. Very well. So we see in verse 62 that Yitzhak was coming along the road from Be'er Lahairoi, for he was living in the Negev. So we had seen that they were in Beersheba, but now he was in Be'er Lahairoi, even more toward the south. And so they were no longer in Beersheba, and he looks up and sees camels approaching. So it's interesting because he looks up to see the camels, and when she is approaching, she looks up and sees him. Now, something that's quite interesting is that when she sees Yitzhak, the Bible in our translation says that she dismounted the camels, but actually the word that is written there comes from the word nafal, which means to fall. So it's like as if saying she literally fell off the camel when she saw him. Why? We don't know, but that's what it says. And she asks the servant who he is, and the servant tells her, "That's my master Yitzhak." And she covers her face with a veil. So you might think, was she shy? Why did she cover her face? Was she trying to hide? No. This face covering has an immense and significant importance. Why? The veiling of a woman, in this case of a bride, can be intensely intimate, as it is the moment when both the bride and the groom signify their preparedness to marry each other. In other words, when Rivka veiled her face, this signified, first of all, her modesty, and second of all, she was literally telling, through this action, she was telling Yitzhak, I'm ready to marry you. I'm prepared to be your wife, to be your bride. And with that, now all Yitzhak had to do was to unveil her in order to discover the beauty beneath. His bride, Rivka. So we see that they get married, and Yitzhak takes Rivka to his mother's tent, and she becomes his wife, and he loved her. And here we see how Rivka fulfills her name's purpose, because it says that Yitzhak was comforted for the loss of his mother. He was made whole again. He had this like gap in him of suffering, of pain after losing his mother. But his connection to Rivka through marriage allowed Yitzhak to become complete again. So if we remember, Rivka means to tie, to bind, to connect. Rivka's purpose was to make Yitzhak feel whole again and to be able to be comforted. In chapter 25, we see from verses 1 through 4 that Avraham takes for himself a new wife, Keturah, and with Keturah, he has 6 children: Zimran, Shua, Medan, Jokshan, Ishbak, and Midian. And of course, they also have other descendants. So in total, we can see that Avraham had 8 children: Yishmael, Yitzhak, and the 6 sons of Keturah. But we see that from verses 5 through 6, Avraham gives Yitzhak everything he owns and sends his other sons to the land of Kedem, the land of the east, away from Yitzhak, to protect Yitzhak from any possible sibling rivalry or attack, as we see later on in the future, how even though they were descendants, or they had the same father, but just by the fact of having a different mother, we'll see how all these descendants become nations and how they're going to be constantly in discord and fighting. And from verses 7 through 10, we see that Abraham dies at the age of 175 years old, and he is buried in the cave of Machpelah with Sarah, who buries him, Yitzhak and Ishmael. So with that, we say goodbye to this wonderful patriarch that we have been learning about, Abraham, and we're going to continue to follow on with the next patriarchs of the beautiful nation of Israel. And the parasha finishes from verses 12 to 13, talking about the genealogy of Ishmael. He had 12 sons who became 12 princes and were the heads of 12 tribes who would indeed become 12 nations. Very well, with that we have concluded our parasha study. And just like all blessings are important and they are significant and they come about, may you all have a blessed week, and may Adonai fill your house with blessings and hug you and make you feel completely loved, because you are loved, because you are his special child. Well, God willing, we will see each other soon, and well, bye-bye.